That is an assumption of neoliberal economics. It makes a lot of assumptions in order to achieve its mathematical neatness. And all the assumptions, perfect information, single representative agents, perfect trust, no information asymmetries, whatever it may be, all of those assumptions are fundamentally extraordinarily stupid. If you had $12 million and you could pay 11 million of those $12 million to avoid coming face to face with the American legal system.
Before we start this podcast, I have one little favor to ask you. Can you please hit the subscribe button down below so we can help more people every single week? Thank you. Because that's something that's very interesting, like the 2-day weekend. So no one really recognized that came in from Henry Ford, right? People presumed, especially my generation, that it was always rolling.
Yeah.
But that was part of the system to get people into factory work. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes. So, I mean, factories, of course, imposed a sort of a level of kind of conformity on time. And of course, it spread to office work because historically the office workers were there to oversee the factory and were often sort of co-located. But no, Ford actually wrote quite intelligently about the need to create not only more wealth, he massively increased the salaries he paid his workers, really quite dramatically, but also the importance of ensuring leisure, because he quite understood, I think, that at the time, to most Americans, who you've got to remember, of course, that at the time, most people had to live within before there were cars, you kind of had to live within walking or busable distance of your employer because there was no other means of getting to work. So in the early stages of the car, of course, a car was much more of a leisure good for many people. It was much more of a leisure purchase. It subsequently became essential because obviously the whole location of both residential and commercial property became predicated on the existence of the car. But in the early days of the car, I mean, there's a wonderful quote from Woodrow Wilson where he says, when he's president of Princeton in about 1909 or something, nothing is doing more to further socialism in the United States than the existence of the automobile, because it's a kind of way in which the wealthy are flaunting their wealth in a trivial leisure pursuit. He's not. Woodrow Wilson in 1909 isn't really seeing the car as a mode of transport. He's seeing it as a luxury good for wealthy Americans. The car industry then fought back and said there are a load of farmers who depend on their cars to take goods to market and so forth. But this was 1909. To be honest, it wasn't. The riposte wasn't true. The car was a luxury good in 1909. I'm always fascinated by this because I actually read a kind of paper by some sociologist written in the 1960s, which almost despaired of improving the living standards of the British working class. Okay, wait for this. Because they were inclined to spend their money on pointless luxuries like washing machines. Pointless luxuries like washing machines. Now, I'm thinking then, hold on a second, okay? This was a time, where a household without washing machines might devote one day of typically the woman's life to the business of laundry and then processing it through a mangle. I can still remember, I was born in 1965, I can still remember British homes that had mangles. What? A mangle, by the way, no. I mean, it wasn't, my family were both richer than average and also very, very gadget friendly. So my grandparents were the fourth family in Wales to own a dishwasher. Fantastically, okay. But just to go to a poorer home, or just a more Luddite home, it wasn't just about wealth. There were people who just were reluctant to get washing machines for whatever reason. And you would actually put the clothes and you would turn a handle and the rollers would effectively squeeze the water out of the clothes after you'd washed them. It's kind of unbelievable in a way.
Well,
I mean, here was someone writing in 1960 about pointless luxuries like the television or the washing machine.
Well, if you think about that resistance, that comes at different stages, right? So the resistance comes before the adoption, before the early stage, before the early adopters, basically. And where I want to start
go ahead. I still believe, by the way, I think Google Glass was a fantastic idea and they quit on it too soon. I would have bought Google Glass. Well, most adoption First of all, they mismarketed it. The fundamental product was good, but you had the problem with glass holes. You also had the privacy problem, which is you could use the device to film, which I think was a mistake. The device needs a camera in order to provide augmented reality. It needs location and a few things. It wasn't necessary for the device to be made capable of filming people, in my view. I think the act of filming someone should be actually, in some ways made visible. Now, you could say, oh, you can have a red light on the thing. Okay. But I actually think, what you might call filming people without their knowledge crosses a line a little bit.
Well, so there are a few details, too, right? That has been done continuously.
No. Oh, continuously, all the time. No. I'm just saying, I regard that as a breach of trust, actually, for someone to record someone without asking. It's a basic courtesy, I think. And so I think Google Glass was a great idea, and they quit on it too soon. I mean, there were a whole load of weird facets around what went wrong, which involved, slightly weird relationship between the project lead and I think Larry or Sergey. It might have been Larry, I can't remember. But I mean, it was fundamentally a great idea. Had they persevered with it, I would own a Google Glass by now. I would find it extremely useful to have a device which just gave me augmentary information without me having to look at anything, take anything out of my pocket, pull up my cuff. I was partly late for the podcast because I didn't have Google Glass. Okay. I have to keep looking at this clock, which is actually behind my microphone. I mean, there are lots and lots of useful applications. So first of all, it's a network good in that you need the developer community to produce for it. And you need enough adopters to make it worth the developer community developing for it. So you have that network effect, which makes innovation slow. And the fax machine is actually an extraordinarily slow pace of adoption, because there were fax machines in the 19th century, but they were so rare as to be effectively useless. I still find it impossible to believe there were fax machines in the 19th century, but apparently they are obviously pretty crude. I had a friend who was the guy who organized the Isle of Wight festivals, and he had a fax machine in the 1970s, but the only person he can remember faxing is his opposite number in the Los Angeles office, and they would fax legal documents back and forth to each other. But he can't remember sending a fax to anybody else because he didn't know anybody else with a fax. And so you have this network effect problem. I mean, at a very simple level, the penny post, okay, which is probably the first, before there was Henry Ford, there was Rowland Hill. And it was the penny post was the first idea where someone said you can make more money by making something cheaper. Because actually scale of a networked postal service means that the cost per mile on aggregated trunk routes, the incremental cost of carrying an extra letter is more or less negligible. Distance, therefore, doesn't matter because most of the costs are in the last mile delivery and in the collection and sorting. The actual distance that the letter, and this extended, by the way, to the imperial penny post under the British Empire, where you could send a letter to anywhere in the British Empire apart from Australia and New Zealand, I think, for 1 penny. So if you're in India and you wanted to write, as Ramanujan did, to G.H. Hardy at Cambridge, it cost you a penny. And that was an extraordinary insight. Now, Rowland Hill had to go to Charles Babbage, i.e. the same Charles Babbage who invented the computer, in inverted commas. Probably, one of the 20 greatest mathematicians on the planet at the time. He had to go to that guy to do the maths to show that his idea fundamentally worked, that you could actually make post very cheap, have a lot of letters. I mean, the contribution that made to the British economy is actually really interesting, because I've never seen anybody try and calculate it. But it always occurred to me that you couldn't really have had the railways unless you had the passenger railways, not the goods railways, unless you had the penny post first. Because you can't just turn up on someone's doorstep 200 miles away and say, I'm here to stay for a week, okay? You had to have the postal and telegram system by which you could make arrangements to meet before it was actually worth boarding a train. So there's a kind of path dependency there, which I've never seen anybody else remark on, but without the penny post, there wasn't really a passenger railway system that could be feasible.
Correct.
And so these network businesses always are slow to take off because they actually require two things to happen. In this case, it's both users and developers.
Mm.
In the case of the post, it's only when it reaches a certain scale that the 1 penny post becomes economic, because obviously, if only one person a day sends a letter, it's an extraordinarily expensive, loss-making proposition. When 1 million people send letters, it's a different matter. And of course, it takes time, because at the beginning of the penny post, people weren't in the habit of writing to people 80 miles away. So they had to learn the habit. And so when you have this habit is obviously a force of friction to adoption. And then you have these network issues where you have to reach a certain scale before the thing becomes feasible. What I'm saying is that Google gave up too soon on Google Glass. You have to wait at least 5 or 6 years, maybe even more, to really see the promise delivered in reality. The theoretical promise only becomes delivered in reality at a certain scale, and reaching that scale takes time. And it's a sigmoid curve. It's slow at first, and then you have a kind of tipping point, which, it happened. I was a very early evangelist for the air fryer, and it was extraordinarily amusing to see the air fryer effectively follow this sigmoid curve. And I predicted it, in fairness, and the reason I predicted it was I simply noticed that everybody who got an air fryer became slightly weirdly enthusiastic about their air fryer in a way that isn't common with, say, yogurt makers or other devices.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, the really valuable metric in Google Glass's case shouldn't have been how many Google Glasses are we selling, because that will be slow to begin with, particularly at a cost of about $1,000. And they only sold them to developers who probably aren't the coolest models for a new fashion product. You wouldn't choose the developer community for their user imagery. Supermodels might be a lot better. But in that case, what they should have looked at, the metric they should have looked at is, when people buy Google Glass, do they go on using it? And an even better one, I would say, as a metric, which is, if your Google Glass broke, would you buy another one? How many you're selling in the early days of a product? What was significant about the air fryer is that everybody who bought an air fryer effectively became converted. It wasn't a case like we've all done this. We bought a yogurt maker or an ice cream maker, and it ends up in a cupboard. And nobody's air fryer. No, that's not quite true. There was a percentage I noticed of people who bought them but just couldn't get them, or more likely had been bought them as a present but were bemused by them. I just don't get the point myself, for whatever reason.
There's
but
one
the
thing as
majority
well.
of people.
Go ahead. Sorry, there's one aspect too that you might find interesting is the virality effect. Them turning into raving fans, right? So with the air fryer, how many times did your family go over to a friend's house and say, "Oh, you can cook that chicken in 10 minutes," and you do nothing, right?
And TikTok was the absolute apotheosis moment, because people started doing air fryer cooking on TikTok, and that was the moment of the point of no return, if you like. That was that crossed the Rubicon for air fryer sales. Yeah.
And what's beautiful there is the fact that most people didn't say, "I'm going to buy an air fryer." They said, "What are you doing? What are you using?" And that creates that basically loop in their brain that they're like, "Well, I've been cooking on this pan for the past 20 years, and now I have a faster, more succinct way of doing it." And you talked about the scale, right? The implementation. This is going to be really interesting, right? Because we're kind of observing old products versus new products. The fax machine could have been fixed by a Dropbox effect, by having the sent by Dropbox or stored by Dropbox, to have people become.
Well, there was no way of sending a fax to anybody without a fax. Now, had email, if you can imagine a system where it was possible to fax something to the Royal Mail and they'd put it into the post, and it would say, "Sent from my fax machine," and you got it through your letterbox. I don't think at any stage Royal Mail invented that, although it wouldn't have been a daft idea, actually, as a way of getting things to people very quickly. In the Victorian age, you would have had a system where you faxed it to the local post office, and a young boy with a cleft stick would have run along to the house, rather like how you learned that your son had died in the First World War. Someone came to your door with a telegram from the War Office, and your life was then ruined. But there wasn't a kind of interconnect way in which you could send a fax except to people with faxes. I had an interesting working life. I started work in 1988, and during my whole working life, I sent one telex and I received one telex. And that was because in the early days, the office in Mumbai, the Ogilvy office in Mumbai, the telephone system was a bit too wonky for fax machines. So if you were making arrangements like someone flying over to visit, that was done still by telex. You communicated to the Mumbai office by telex. And so I had to send a telex and I received one. That was it, sum total in my entire working life. The faxes are innumerable ones. But then, of course, email killed that. Not necessarily for the good, by the way, because the friction, this is another thing worth knowing, that friction is generally something we try and reduce, but a certain level of friction in certain activities, like communication, is actually beneficial. It is too easy to email people. It's too easy to copy people. It's totally inexpensive. There's no cost to copying 17 irrelevant people. And as a consequence, the burden of email has been shifted, or the burden of communication has been shifted from the sender, which was preparation costs and transmission costs in the case of a letter. And the burden's now been shifted to the recipient, who has to spend an hour and a half sifting through emails every day, just in case there's something important.
Yeah.
And that's been a catastrophe for productivity. Now, the thing that worries me about AI is we're all looking at things that are a pain in the arse, okay, and thinking, won't it be great if those things are less of a pain in the arse? Well, what about AI lawyers, right? I mean, the reason I don't ever get litigious with any of my neighbors or anybody else, I never get involved with the legal system at all if I can possibly avoid it. And the reason for that is simply that it's expensive, and I'd rather not spend a lot of my time talking to lawyers. Okay. Now, what happens if every time your neighbor's tree damages the fence, you can go to AIlawyer.com and issue a kind of cease and desist order or demand compensation through an automated mechanism? Our lives are going to be made absolutely miserable. There are certain things which need to be kept expensive and slow and cumbersome in order to keep them in check. And so, the prospect of a world in which you can effectively have the benefits of Carter Ruck, okay, this is a British, highly litigious British legal practice, available on your desktop for £7.50, okay, that terrifies the shit out of me. It absolutely terrifies me, because I'm sure, for example, in the course of the odd YouTube video, I have shown in the background a slide which is probably copyright. All right? Okay, I'm preparing a presentation. I'm not expecting the presentation to go on YouTube. I want a picture of a man in a hat. I get a picture of a man in a hat and go, thank God for that. I got a picture of a man in a hat. That's what I needed. And then what's going to happen is that in 2038, I'm going to have demands for and the demands will start for a demand of $100,000 to compensate me for the use of my, I think everybody in business has done it. I don't always expect the thing to go up on YouTube. I'm thinking of it as something internal, entirely for internal purposes. If someone quotes me on a podcast, now I'm not going to do this because I generally hate litigation as a mode of solving problems. It strikes me as, fundamentally adversarial and uncreative. And that's probably very unfair to the legal profession, but nonetheless, I find those adversarial means of solving problems fundamentally economically negative sum. But I mean, this world where, effectively someone, without crediting me, quotes something I said on a podcast, and I'm free, if I want to go and search, effectively prior art, I think is and claim that they were actually plagiarizing me or something. Now you have, or you only need, 50 people to be assholes, or a legal firm to decide they're going to do this and then demand a cut of the proceeds. I mean, in defense of Prince Andrew, okay, if you had, I'm going to ask you this question, if you had, without any intimation on whether the guy is guilty or innocent or whether he did anything, or, which is perfectly possible, by the way, nothing at all right? Right. If you had $12 million and you could pay 11 million of those $12 million to avoid coming face to face with the American legal system. All right. Now, what that means is you have a jury trial in the United States where there's, where a runaway jury could suddenly demand that you went to jail or whatever it may be, okay, regardless of the actual evidential value of anything presented, okay. Would I pay $11 million to avoid being, forced to plea bargain, for example, or similar? Okay, with the American legal system, and I only had $12 million in the world, would I spend 11 million to avoid that? Every fucking time. Because the worst case scenario, maybe there's only a 10% chance of the worst case scenario, but the worst case scenario is 15 years in fucking Leavenworth or something, right?
Yeah,
okay,
sure,
right?
For sure.
There's no sodding way. And as a Brit, or as a non-American, my expectation of a fair trial is further diminished, I would argue. If you're a prince, there's the old tall poppy thing that, there's going to be a kind of, hey, we've got, empathy, regardless of any evidence. Would I pay $11 million to avoid that every solid day of the week? Yeah, no hesitation.
And that's the problem, right?
What's your take on that? Would you do the same?
100%. And it's also happening, right? It's a friction, right? The fact that, same with the medical system. You'll find this quite interesting. I was quite young and had a very bad accident in my leg, and it wasn't spotted. So I got a blood clot on my knee, and it wasn't spotted. And about 4 days later, I had to get like a removal of a blood clot. And rumor has it, if it was above my knee, it would have went to my heart, and I would have died. Okay, but
you could have died.
Yeah.
You can,
and I almost lost my leg, but I didn't. It was fine, whatever. But I remember specifically, I was told to not pursue it, because if I pursued it, I'd never ever be treated ever again. And I didn't want to pursue it, right? I was just a kid. I was like, whatever. But it made me.
They threatened you. They threatened you. Which medical system was this? Was this in Ireland or in
Europe? Yeah, I was in Europe, and
in Europe.
And basically what it was like, because basically with your knee, I dislocated my kneecap initially, and it's very fragile, right? So as in, it's not anymore, but it is when you're younger, that you could have done it again. And I remember specifically, this is what, malpractice is one of the biggest areas of debt in America. It's rated number the top. One of the reasons, I think it is like the top actually. And one of the reasons why is just because like the cases around it, the investigation, it's so lengthy, right? So this is interesting because this is the pros and the cons for like technology and advancements, and especially AI as well. And I just thought it was interesting because that process is so long to drag you through, that the counter side to that, and I know you can talk about the counter trend sometimes, is the fact that that process would have been drawn out forever until I would have been bankrupt. Does that make sense? So we have it on both sides of the spectrum. Do you want to launch a podcast for your business, but you don't know where to start? Remove the stress, pressure, and all the overwhelm that comes with it by working with Podcast University. If you're an ambitious individual who wants to build your influence online, grow your own podcast, and also stand out from the crowd, Podcast University is for you. We help you with the strategy, equipment, the content, your guests, everything you need to create a top-tier podcast. If you want to learn more, check out Podcast University and start your podcast journey today.
So I had a similar case, which my grandmother, in an extreme case of dental malpractice, several dentists failed to pick up on the fact that she had cancer of the jaw until it was quite late. Fortunately, her son-in-law was a GP, and he said, let me just take a look. And he took a look and he said, get to the hospital in Chepstow first thing Monday morning. He said, you have to go straight to the hospital. No messing around with a GP, straight there. Okay. Now, this was undoubtedly malpractice. My grandmother, bear in mind, had been married to a general practitioner for 25 years. It was unthinkable for her to sue a doctor. It was just something, it would have been unthinkable. And, a large number of people I'm pretty much like that, actually. I'd be incredibly, unless there was actual deliberate malice involved, I wouldn't do it. And now, what happens, you only need 5% of people, because we already have a problem with people who are excessively litigious. I mean, I had a great aunt actually who kind of she spent something like 5 years of her life involved in litigation with the West Glamorgan ambulance service because they'd been too slow to pick up her sister. And she got kind of weirdly obsessed with this. And eventually, I think there is a kind of mechanism in the UK for effectively preventing excessive pursuit of litigation. I can't remember what the legal term for this is. But is it Barrett? No, I'm not quite sure. I'll have to try and remember. But anyway, the problems that could be caused, because we already know this, because in social media we have no real friction. Okay, there's no friction of communication, and so these informational asymmetries become just ridiculously exaggerated. And talking to Dan Ariely about this yesterday, actually, which is he makes this point that we spend a lot of time trying to reduce friction because we believe in efficiency, but there are times when you should add friction into the system. That actually, for example, making something effortful. What happens, if you can AI automate applications to universities? It just becomes absurd. Then you have effectively the universities have to instigate AI to deal with and sift application. And so you're effectively paying, to some extent, this has happened with Google algorithms, right, with advertising, which is you're paying some of the brightest minds in the world to play chess with Google's algorithm. And here you'll be paying some of the brightest minds in the world effectively to pay computers, to design computers to play chess with each other, And then it will be utterly absurd because you will be told as a prospective applicant to Yale that it's absolutely essential that you get into beach volleyball or something. The whole thing will become bonkers because at some level, cost and effort is emblematic of effort. And in advertising, of course, effort is emblematic of sincerity. The extent to which you pay to say something or you go to some lengths to say it. In bought media is used to infer the extent to which you're committed to what you're saying.
That's interesting.
So this is, we can already see this, which is no one has thrown away a FedEx envelope unopened. I think, I'm sure it's happened by accident, but I can basically say that if you receive something by FedEx, unless you're kind of George Soros or something, right? Right. You basically go, someone's paid 8 quid, 15 quid to send this to me. I better have a look. Because it is worthy of my attention, because they wouldn't spend £15 talking to 10,000 people, but they might spend £15 talking to the 100 people who matter. Therefore, this possibly matters to me. This is, in other words, it's relevant because it's expensive. And you make that free. And now, has anybody deleted an email unopened? That would be perhaps 95% of my inbox, maybe even more. Is actually unopened because the cost of sending it is so low that I make no inference of the importance of the contents whatsoever. And so we've already got this lesson with email, which is that actually low friction, low cost actually quite often shifts the burden from one place, the sender, to another, the recipient, who now has to devote, in my case, an hour and a half a day effectively to prioritization of the 7 emails in my inbox that actually matter. And what will happen, I think, with AI is we'll simply see a massive shifted burden, in many ways, which is, you're making it easier for people who want to be a pain in the arse, and you're making it harder for people who want to do a decent job. We forget this about technology, that technology is a bit like fertilizer. It accelerates things, right? Now, when you fertilize a patch of ground, the question is, do the weeds actually benefit more than the flowers do? Right? Now, I would argue that one of the things we've seen as a consequence of technology is a massive explosion of corporate bureaucracy. The size of finance departments, IT departments, HR departments seems to consistently balloon because of the amount of information available that has to be processed. It means that people have delegated to HR functions which are really part of your own job as a manager, which is to decide who works for you and how you look after them. That was originally called your job back in the 1980s, right? Was looking after your team and continually pruning them. That was your job as a practitioner. And now, of course, all of this stuff has been hived off into kind of separate bureaucracies. And
Well,
it means actually that you no longer really have the relationship with your co-workers that you once would have had, of sort of mentorship and, guidance and support, which, in professions like medicine, that was everything. If you were in the right team with the right person, okay, an eminent surgeon, and you were part of their team, that was how it was a mini monarchy. There were undoubtedly, by the way, it led to some abuses, and we all know what I'm talking about here. Okay,
mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, anthropologically, that was kind of how capitalism worked,
Mm-hmm.
and we've replaced it now with kind of a formalist, bureaucratic, reductionist sort of structure. And I don't think, I think at the emotional level, I think it's deeply disheartening to people in the world of work, because you're box ticking. You're not really exercising judgment anymore. You're jumping through hoops.
If you think about how that's come down from, you said from the organization, how things are showing up online with paid advertising. I was just speaking to a client before this about like writing an ad for LinkedIn. And I just think about how all those advancements have made everything look so bland and so basic, that how do you think about how advertising was versus how advertising is now compared to that?
Very occasionally, and it really is occasionally, you see a banner ad and you go, oh. And it's
100% agree.
extraordinarily potent, because you feel some human love and attention and care has gone into scripting that ad. It might be a piece of AI genius. I'm not discounting that. It's possible, by the way, perfectly possible. Or it might be that the AI comes up with a piece of genius and a human spots it. I mean, it could be any combination of those things.
Great.
But it's absurdly rare. I mean, it's, that it's a bit like exactly the problem that happened to car design when the wind tunnel became dominant. You have these particular metrics, which is the, coefficient of air resistance. And the consequence was every car started to look the same. I mean, I was looking at I'm a huge fan of modern architecture. I'm not a Luddite by any means, okay? But there was a thing sent out by some art magazine, which was the 25 best architectural practices in Denmark. And you look at number 1, you look at number 2, and you look at number 3, and they're bloody good. But I said, by the time you get to about number 14, you're dying for a bit of mock Tudor. You'd like a bit of Gothic. You'd like just something else, please. But it's even worse with the advertising, because I think, the love and care has gone into that building. It's just all gone into the same things. Okay. In advertising, actually, you feel that most of it has been, it's kind of just add water, cup of soup kind of advertising, where there's a very, very basic formula and it's highly transactional. There's no added emotional component to it. There's no surprise. There's no actually not much in the way of promise either. And most of it's highly transactional. Save 20% on. I always thought the point of advertising was to get people to pay more for things, not to get people to buy things they would have bought anyway, but at a discount by buying them sooner. But I suspect that a large part of online advertising is doing the latter, not the first job. It's getting people to buy something they might have bought anyway at full price, but speeding up their purchase a bit by offering a discount.
It's more following the frameworks, right? It's like, this is the framework that X company have used or X entrepreneur has used. This is a model that you can bring from health to fitness, from fitness to relationships, from relationships to investing. It's like, it worked over here. Let's reuse this model. And it's almost like, I hear you talk about this a lot too, about the creative versus the marketer, the logical versus creative brain. Like, it's almost like we've taken away the creative aspect because of fear of tanking an ad campaign or tanking a marketing campaign.
Now, I'll be candid. I worked in direct marketing, and we used to get this about right. We used to say that a third of it's creative, a third of it's media and targeting, and a third of it's what we call the offer, which is sort of everything else. But we sort of free bird table with every da-da-da, whatever it might be. And I don't think it was a third, but actually that was roughly the right ratio of attention to pay. The mainstream advertising industry back in the 80s paid far too little attention to media and targeting. They thought once you got the message sorted, it didn't really matter that much where you put it. I think Tom Goodwin's been saying this on Twitter recently. It was far too little attention to targeting. They paid far too little attention to things like customer experience, far too little attention to things like, contextual selling and things of that kind. It was just we produced this one fantastic ad idea and everybody gets to see it, which was sort of a bit true in the 1980s if you had a reasonably large media budget. But nonetheless, there was still a huge gain to be had there in more intelligent targeting. But now the tech industrial complex, which is effectively obsessed with what you can quantify, has caused 95% of the effort to go towards targeting and about 5% to anything else. And that's completely out of whack. But there's also a problem, which is fundamentally, if you want to grow a business, you sell effectively and profitably to as many people as you can. Okay. The job is not to maximize ROI by selling to the very small number of people who will buy what you have to offer, basically without any sales effort or additional investment being required. Okay. That's an efficiency model. And that's the model which you see in supermarkets where they're trying to drive everybody to use self-checkout, okay, because they see that as the lowest cost per sale mode of selling, so they want to impose it on all their customers. My marketing viewpoint would be you sell profitably to as many people as you can, and if in order to sell to them, it requires you to operate a checkout with a human being scanning the stuff and having a chat with them, that's the price you pay for having more customers and having more customers buy from you more frequently. Okay, so there's a double whammy there. And now what's happened is what we're optimizing for is we're not optimizing for the long-term value of the relationship. We're optimizing for the profitability of the one-off transaction. But they're not the same thing. In fact, they're very badly misaligned. There's a big misalignment problem there. So let me give you a lovely example of this, which is I am a huge, passionate fan of my Quooker tap, which is a tap which has a device under the sink which effectively boils water or heats water in a highly insulated container, and then you have boiling water on demand. Okay. Now, to sell that to me, my daughter wanted one. I'm a gadget lover, so I was broadly speaking enthusiastic, and my wife was skeptical. And I was conscious of the fact that this is obviously brilliant, but I am spending like 800 quid on doing what a kettle kind of does. Okay. And they said, well, we can give you a demonstration in our showroom. And I said, okay, well, where's your showroom? They said, it's in Manchester. I said, I'm not sure I'm going to travel to Manchester just to see a demonstration of, however brilliant your device is. And they said, no. It's not a physical demonstration. We've got a studio set up in Manchester, and we'll give you a live kind of Zoom call where with 6 various cameras in different locations, where we can demonstrate the different designs of tap, what the tap does, how it works. We can answer your questions. It was a 30-minute Zoom call. Let's be honest, it probably cost them, difficult to say, but 20, 30 pounds to do that call with us. And at the end of the call, after 30 minutes, we'd answered our questions. My daughter was sold, I was sold, at which point my wife was probably neutral, but we had a majority at that point. And they said, oh, by the way, because you've had our little demonstration, we can give you a discount of 70%. And we bought it. There are people, and they would include like the super rich, people who've owned a Quooker before, okay? There are people who would just go online, order the thing, pay 800 quid, have it delivered, okay? There are people. And those people are hugely profitable because you don't have to talk to them for 20 minutes or 30 minutes in order to sell them tap. Great, fantastic. If those people are willing to do that, provide them with a channel that allows them to do it, great, fine, dandy. But if you demand that everybody buys the thing that way, you're losing I would guess you're losing 2/3 of potential new customers. And the same would apply to something like financial advice, okay? If you want to sell someone a pension, there are people who will just go online, research the whole thing, buy the pension. all right? But the majority of people require some sort of conversation with a human being before you undertake a momentous decision. Now, the good news is they'll do that over Zoom. So you don't have to send a bloke to their house in a car and, spend half a day traveling to see your prospective customers. But you can't take that from Zoom, I would argue, down to a simple email or a phone call. You need face-to-face contact. And, there is just a necessary level of mental persuasion that is required to get people to do certain things. And, where possible, reduce it. Some people I prefer buying railway tickets from a machine than from a person if I know exactly what I want. But if I'm not absolutely sure what I want, and I don't completely trust my own appreciation of which ticket I need, I want to go to the guy, and the guy in Deal, where I sometimes go, is kind of mates with everybody who lives in Deal, who says, well, actually, if you're going on the 927, what I'll do is I'll get you an off-peak return to Dover, and then you can a peak time return to Dover, and then you can buy an off-peak return from Dover into London. This is hypothetical, okay? But it's actually cheaper. And you go, oh, brilliant. So now I know I'm getting the best value for money for my ticket. Whereas if I bought it from the machine, I wouldn't have a clue because the machine might not bother to tell me if there was a cheaper option. In fact, it probably wouldn't. So what I'm saying is that the act of actually transacting, right, quite often comes with an attendant cost. If you optimize to reduce that cost, what you're not noticing is the opportunity cost of all the new customers you no longer have because you're demanding they transact in one way rather than another. And I think this is becoming, this ROI-driven kind of quantification bias in business is one of the reasons we're not growing anymore. It's because, I think a lot of it comes from assumptions of neoliberal economics, which is that there is pre-existing demand. The demand is simply for the product or service as defined most narrowly. And your job is to then satisfy that pre-existing demand, not to create demand, not to actually generate demand, not to grow your customer base. It is simply to satisfy what level of previous pre-existing demand there is at the lowest possible cost. And I think that is an assumption of neoliberal economics. It makes a lot of assumptions in order to achieve its mathematical neatness. And all the assumptions, perfect information, single representative agents, perfect trust, no information asymmetries, whatever it may be, all of those assumptions are fundamentally extraordinarily stupid. I mean, they're necessary if you want to turn things into equations, but no good mathematician would assume something for the purposes of constructing a mathematical model if the assumption were blatantly untrue, okay? Let's assume that water boils at 50 degrees, all right? A physicist would go, this is bullshit, because it doesn't unless you're at high altitude, I guess. Okay, right? Let's assume for the purposes of this calculation that, the water is in a bad mood and so doesn't want to boil. Okay, right, okay, whatever it may be. Anybody with any reputable scientific chops would go, you're full of shit. And yet economists get away with it all the time. And that brings us back to the original point about things like income inequality, which is Gary Stevenson, whether you like him or don't. I mostly like him, actually. Which he makes the point, which is if you have a single representative agent model in economics, by definition, you're not noticing inequality because your single representative agent is a product of aggregates, right? So it doesn't capture disparities by definition.
And the last thing in there is the variance, right? Economists will put any sort of outside variables down to variance and therefore account for like a small variance in it, which is like the reason why the accuracy doesn't work, right? And that's the reason why. Are you an entrepreneur who wants to build your influence and authority online? You may have tried some of the hacks and tricks, but none of it has worked. And it makes sense. 90% of podcasts don't make it to episode 3. Of the 10% that are left, 90% of them don't make it to episode 20. That's where Voix comes in. Voix creates, manages, and grows your podcast for you on your behalf. If you've not been getting leads, not been growing consistently, you haven't found your tribe, and you don't know what to do, Voex is the answer. Don't just take our word for it. In the past couple of years, we've managed over 35 podcasts. We've also been able to generate over 55 million views with 500 episodes produced. And not only that, generating over $1 million for our clients in products, services, and sponsorships. So if you want to learn more about how you can build a great podcast and have it fully managed for you, schedule a call with me at Voex and we will help you achieve your podcast goals.
But it's also the variance isn't. I mean, this is why I suppose Nassim Taleb gets so angry about Gaussian distributions, right? Because most real life things aren't actually like that. Height is, to an extent, okay, but wealth isn't, for example. Yes, there are things like height, which are broadly speaking distributed around a mean, and even then, obviously, there are no people who are 1 inch tall, but there are no people who are 9 feet tall. And so you can, there's a reason for that, by the way, which is they're probably dead in either case, right? Okay. They don't actually make it to viability. And so nature is chopping off the top and chopping off the bottom, to an extent. But most things in life are not distributed that way, for example, if you look at very simply, brand success, there are very strong winner-takes-all effects. There tends to be a dominant brand which has disproportionate market share relative to the number 2 brand, which has disproportionate market share relative to the number 3 brand, and so on. You get that pattern recurring every time. But it's not, you would expect commonly to have kind of within a category 3 or 4 equally potent players, but it tends not to work like that. That's actually one reason to advertise, which is that if you can get to a position of dominance in terms of share of what you might call share of voice. Okay, if you have dominance over share of voice, you will tend to have dominance over market share because market share tends to track to share of voice over time. And if you actually have dominant share of voice, then you enjoy those extraordinary, what Ehrenberg, I think, called the double jeopardy effect, which is more people buy you, and the people who do buy from you buy more often. So in other words, you're in more people's repertoire, and among those people in whose repertoire you sit, you form a greater part of their purchases. And so that's a classic example of showing. Of course, the Ehrenberg Bass Institute is dedicated effectively to 2 graphs. It's kind of the Ehrenberg thing, which I think is there's a name for it actually, the distribution. And I've briefly forgotten what it's called. And then, of course, there's the Bass diffusion curve, which is the idea that the adoption of new products follows a sigmoid curve. But it's really important that people know this because, as I said, Google gave up on Google Glass far too early. And they didn't stick around for long enough to answer the relevant question, which was not how many people are buying this compared to last quarter or the quarter before that. It's of the people who are buying it, are they using it regularly and reliably? And are they perhaps advocating for it?
For sure.
Right. I mean, talking to Ocado, they're very smart in that they look at products in 2 ways. How much do they sell? That's kind of the aggregate. But they also upweight those products which a few people buy very regularly. So you probably, I don't know. So when you go back to Ireland or the UK, you go back to Europe, and you for a week or so, what do you take back to Bali? Not Marmite, is it? I don't know. Okay, what is it you can't get in?
Probably coffee. So Sumatra coffee is obviously very famous.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, so Sumatra, but then there's also Bali coffee. There's probably writing, books, different types of things that are made locally. You wouldn't get elsewhere.
No, so you take because I think I generally find, I mean, coffee's called Java for a reason.
100%.
Broadly speaking, it's fantastic. There's fantastic Colombian coffee and Rwandan coffee and so forth. But I find Sumatran coffee and Javanese coffee disproportionately good, I have to say.
100%.
But then if you come back from Europe, there'll be things you bring back from Europe that are difficult to get in Bali, okay? So, I don't know. Can you get Marmite in Bali? I need to check
No,
before I go.
it's probably only tea. I remember I had I actually had tea from Ireland recently, and I was like, damn, I haven't had this in like 4 years.
And it's not Thompson's Punjana, is it? That's a very good Irish tea, which I've discovered
No,
recently.
it's Barry's tea.
I know of it, yeah. And it's interesting because what's clever with Ocado is they basically say, look, if this, but not many people buy Bird's grape nuts. Okay, it's funny, it was David Ogilvy's favorite, one of David Ogilvy's favorite foods, breakfast cereal. Okay, but the people who buy it a lot, and Ocado are shrewd enough to know, and people with a loyalty card would also spot this. Say Tesco would look at club card data and go, if the 5% of people who are buying this thing are repeat buyers, we shouldn't delist it, even if the sales are comparatively unexciting, because if you take away 3 or 4 of those products, and bear in mind with Ocado, you quite often go to Ocado to buy the things which are either difficult to buy elsewhere or really difficult to find. Because one great thing about online shopping is you just type in Korean gochujang sauce or whatever. If you've got something obscure like that you buy regularly, it's a bloody pain in the arse to find on the shelves of a supermarket. And so Ocado quite cleverly look at both dimensions. How much does it sell overall? Because if a lot of it's selling. And of course, with a new product, the thing to look at, let's say you have something, okay, there are products which I call epiphany products, and they would include Japanese toilets, air fryers, etc., cooker taps. You won't know about this, but there's a brand of Black Bomber Snowdonia cheddar, mature Welsh cheddar, which in its early days, it's now become unbelievably huge as a brand. In its early days, it was a niche product, but what you noticed was that people who bought it again. And so that was what Google should have been looking at with Google Glass, not going net popularity sales, crazy that a company that well capitalized should have such a short-termist approach to innovation.
Well, if you think about it, right, the main indicator they weren't optimizing for, and what you're looking at has separated a lot of the bigger brands, right? If a small like retail place is putting out the same product so that people can come in and get access to the other products, and bear in mind Google is a suite of products, it gives you foot in the door, right? So if you looked at Influenced by Robert Cialdini, it's the foot in the door effect of commitment. Once you make the small commitment and get them across the door, then you open them up through the value ladder and they will graduate throughout that evolution, right? And that's the entire goal of marketing, is to get someone to evolve through the different transitions of what you have. They won't buy the $5,000 package right now, but they could start out with the $39 little ebook.
Now, you get, products at a different phase of maturity. What Apple is facing now is, one, they've probably in many markets reached maximum penetration, in that there are people like me who are kind of Android till I die, who will never be seduced here. Then you get a slower rate of replacement. Okay, so people used to replace their phones and tablets maybe every 2 to 3 years, and it's gone to sort of 4. Because one reason, by the way, very boring reason, but the phones are waterproof. Okay, there used to be a lovely source of new phones just caused by people dropping them in a puddle. Okay, or they're dustproof, waterproof. Generally, phone case technology, I think, has improved, so the level of breakage has declined. And so, they probably have they've reached the asymptotic bit of the mass diffusion curve, where penetration in developed markets, can't speak for anywhere else, might have reached a kind of limit, a natural kind of ceiling. I don't know what the ceiling is for air fryers. You could argue it's ultimately 100%. But I mean, and also you have the whole thing with tablets. Okay, one of the reasons why it's difficult for people don't replace tablets nearly so frequently. You might argue also that the tablet is a brilliant way into the Android ecosystem, and the reason is that most people use their tablets for media consumption. All right. And they use their tablets for media consumption. And so the Apple ecosystem, if you're mostly using Netflix or YouTube or whatever, or Kindle, indeed the Kindle reader, is less critical having the Apple ecosystem. You don't need a parking app for your tablet. I mean, I do have parking apps on my tablet, but I mean, you don't need it. And so, you might argue that's actually the gateway drug to getting people the vaping alternative to the Apple ecosystem, the gateway drug out, as it were. Mm-hmm. So you're right. I mean, but if you have people who are looking at these things in linear ways, or they're expecting, that you can project forwards a sigmoid curve from its very low level at the beginning, you're misreading the situation. I mean, social change, by the way. I mean, if you look at, sometimes it's very fast. I mean, you might say acceptance of same-sex marriage was kind of perhaps should be a textbook case because it basically went from nobody to more or less everybody. Mm-hmm. There'll still be, there'll still be outliers, but broadly speaking, I come across quite a lot of conservative people, other than a few, other than practitioners in certain religions, for example. It'll be a while before you get the Catholic Church on board, but then it's not the job of the Catholic Church to jump on every bandwagon, is it? Because that's why it's
Ireland
2,000
did lead
years
that,
old.
though, right?
If you had to predict in 1970 that Ireland would liberalise same-sex marriage before Germany did, which is actually what happened. Okay, you could have got astounding odds on that with any bookmaker. The fact that Ireland would approve this before Germany did, but it's very interesting because it was achieved. I mean, I think people should study it much more because it was achieved actually relatively pretty amicably. By contrast, you have other things which take years. I mean, drink driving is an interesting one because you won't know this. There are drink drivers now. There will always be drink drivers, not least because pissed people aren't brilliant decision makers, right? Okay, but among my parents' generation, the majority of their friends wouldn't have much compunction other than the fear of disqualification for driving home drunk. Now, my parents, I'm just going to defend the memory of my late parents by saying they didn't. In fact, my father said once that he thinks he drunk over the limit once in his life. To be absolutely candid, I've probably done it once, actually. Borderline, to be honest, it was borderline, I would say. But it was a highly rural route, etc. But I'm not defending myself. But by my parents' generation, it was normalized that, if you could dodge the cops and get away with it, that was considered fine. Among my children's generation, it's considered morally reprehensible to do it, regardless of any threat of fine or disqualification. It's considered a morally reprehensible act. That took, 40 years. It's a generational thing. I mean, we need to understand this in terms of environmentalism, by the way, which is the way in which we're trying to promote environmental behavior is to imagine a perfect behavior and then to draw a straight line from present behavior to future behavior without understanding what are the paths people have to go through in order to... now, it's worth noting that before there was same-sex marriage, there was, of course, decriminalization. If you go back to it, it's very, very strange and very interesting because we always assume it was the left who led the charge for the decriminalization of homosexuality. It wasn't. Weirdly, the Anglican Church in the UK was significantly in favour of the decriminalisation of homosexuality before it was a political issue, which when you tell people this, they go, no, this is rubbish, okay? There have been various churches like the Quakers, I think, who had basically campaigned for this. Quakers are basically ahead of the curve on everything. Okay, I don't know why we don't listen to them more. It's a very, very thoughtful... That's the only way I can explain it. There's certain aspects of Quakerism which are highly egalitarian, very much concerned with decency to your fellow man. Pacifism is a large part, is to some extent a large part of it. Many Quakers are vegetarian, for example. I mean, no, by no means, not all Quakers are pacifists. But it's a very, very thoughtful. So I'll give you one example of this. Quaker businesses were fantastically successful. Partly because you didn't need any lawyers, because in Quakerism, your word is your bond, and therefore anything you say has the force of an oath. So if you had two Quakers and one of them wanted to buy the other's chocolate factory, they'd just go, how much would you like for your chocolate factory? Well, I would sell it for, 20,000 guineas. And the other Quaker would say, yes, I will pay you 20,000 guineas. That's the end of it. No lawyers, no papers. The whole thing has has legal force because you said it. Now, I don't know what happens if the Quakers pissed or something. I don't know how that works, but it was an extraordinary thing in that you effectively could do business between Quakers simply on the basis of course, most Quakers don't drink. Again, it varies. I knew a Quaker who did drink. Some of them won't drink tea or coffee. It's all very strange. But nonetheless, it's very, very thoughtful. And it's also very, very benign, actually, towards because you believe that everybody is possessed of kind of inner light, and so it has some really quite interesting attributes. But it's very interesting because part of the reason they were very successful in business is because they were very, very honest. And so Cadbury, I think it might have been Terry's, Cadbury's, Rowntree's, Terry's, all the chocolate firms were Quaker in Britain, the big brands. And that was because they wanted to sell chocolate, specifically drinking chocolate, as a treat that was an alternative to alcohol. So they started these chocolate companies almost with a moral dimension, moral purpose. And then I think Cadbury's, or possibly Rowntree, I can't remember which, started printing the price on the packaging. And they print 1D chocolate bar, whatever it was. Okay, that wasn't normal at the time. The shop normally charged what it thought it could get away with, but they printed the price on the chocolate bar.
What?
And the reason for that was it was what they called square dealing. This is what the chocolate bar costs. We think the retailer deserves a margin for selling the chocolate, but the consumer should pay a fair price for the chocolate too. It turned out this thing they'd introduced, which was done for moral reasons, was actually very popular with consumers because they didn't have to haggle, or they didn't have, they felt that this was fundamentally honest, and it was a great way of selling chocolate. Okay, but the original intention of putting the price on the chocolate was not to sell chocolate. It was an emblematic of kind of their philosophy of business, which involved, being very, very straight and fair with a customer or a consumer in this case. Mm-hmm. And but anyway, the Spectator, right-wing publication, was known in the 1960s as the Bugger's Bugle because it campaigned for the decriminalisation of homosexuality early. It's very interesting because we have this stupid narrative of social progress. But for example, votes for women were introduced under a Conservative government in the UK. Okay. The idea that there's this very simple, straightforward narrative of kind of, certain forces opposing something, other forces supporting something, and that generally, that it was the left-wing people who are on the side of the good, doesn't really stand up if you go back far enough in time to understand various past movements. The anti-slavery movement was not Shaftesbury was a Tory. Some of them were Whigs. It was a cross-party movement. It wasn't really politicized in that sense. And I think actually the politicization of a lot of these movements has actually made them less effective. I think because you're effectively trying to tie yourself up with a sense of identity. The most extreme case of all this was not quite true, by the way, the idea that Hitler was a vegetarian. Undoubtedly an animal lover. But the idea that there's this absolutely strict, actually movements should be movements, and they should be to some extent, how strange is this, right? That your attitude to nuclear weapons throughout the 80s, say, was broadly speaking determined by political allegiance. Well, unless you're happy for the Soviets to invade, which I suppose would be an extreme left-wing position, right? Whether you think it's a good idea for the UK to have nuclear weapons or not, which is a highly complicated question. At the time, I thought we should keep nuclear weapons. We lucked out. Was that a good decision? I still don't know. But the idea that kind of broke down on purely political lines was kind of weird. When you think about it.
If you go back to like the deterministic factor and deterministic mindset within like political parties, how that goes back to marketing, splitting the audience, creating an enemy, and throwing stones at the enemy. So when you could have made
Yes.
progress, and like the left were having right behaviors, the right had left behaviors, instead of looking at progress in isolation, they look at the opposition and throw stones at them. And that is Twitter today. That's every social platform. It's Twitter in absolute essence. And yeah, it's
Because
crazy.
I can't go on Twitter and give my views about the Israel-Palestine conflict because my views are nuanced. I would argue they're extremely reasonable. Okay, but I would arouse the ire. Now, this was an interesting thing that happened in Eurovision. Okay, which is that the public vote, the telephone vote in the UK and in Germany and in possibly France, I can't remember. There are about 5 countries which gave Israel 12 points. Israel picked up about 300 points in the public vote. Okay, they were coming in the second half of the scoreboard after the jury vote. Now, all I'm saying is that without making any comments about the rights and wrongs of the thing, one of the things that we have to be alert to, I'm going to raise a really interesting point here. I think that demonstrations and the media attention given to demonstrations is kind of bullshit. All right. One, in the days when you got beaten up by the police, being on a demonstration was at least proof of sincerity. Okay. It doesn't really matter whether I agree with you or not. I can infer from that you are devoted to your cause because you're risking physical violence or arrest, as is still the case in many, many countries. Right? If the police are actually there to protect you, okay, right? Okay, I'm not sure it carries quite the same freight. But think about how extraordinarily asymmetrical this is, because the people who are willing to demonstrate, or who in some cases enjoy demonstrating, okay, are not representative of the public at large, and yet they have a source of media attention which is denied to. There are virtually no circumstances I can imagine. No, that's not true. But I'm just not that kind of person, right? Yeah. As I joked, if you're to the right of centre and you're angry about something, you have 2 possible outlets. You write a stiff letter to the Daily Telegraph, or you buy an assault rifle. There's no middle ground. Right? Okay, if you're on the right, okay, we don't have this middle ground of traipsing through the streets. All right. And so my question there, I'll have to go into 2 minutes, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no
but my question there is, this is extraordinary asymmetry, because it's massively unfair to people who don't live in London. I mean, the people of Liverpool, okay, would have to burn their city to the ground to get the same media attention about a grievance as people in London can get by just wandering aimlessly through the streets, right, carrying placards. It's massively unfair to introverts, to claustrophobics, to people who just don't like walking aimlessly through the streets, which I think covers a very large body of people. And it's incredibly unfair to people like me who would not participate even when I sympathized, for the simple reason that the whole nuance that any form of demonstration tends people towards a sunk cost investment in an extreme position. And therefore, maybe, but there's the final question, which I genuinely mean, by the way, this is, we don't even know that it works. Okay. Now,
100%.
Okay, 100%. We know that the civil rights thing, is it actually counterproductive? We know the civil right. If I see a load of people who I think of as doing, I don't understand football. Okay, I just don't understand it. Okay, I don't understand why you get worked up about it. Okay, but and so people who are obsessed about football kind of fucking annoy me, right? Because okay, don't get me wrong, I'm not. You're the same. I just don't understand it, right? Okay, now. If you look at the civil rights movement, it worked. But then there was first of all, there was undoubtedly commitment. If you look at the way in which the protests were actually conducted, there was extraordinary intelligence behind the organisers of Selma or whatever. I mean, really, really clever stuff. And So the effective promulgation of people with the most of the opinions of the people with the most extreme view, which is broadly speaking what happens, I think is frequently counterproductive. Mm-hmm. And no one ever considers this, that actually, you're actually effectively forcing people who would otherwise be pretty. Okay, there's that weird thing, isn't there, which is, I'm pretty sympathetic to vegetarianism. I'm pretty sympathetic to, quite a few. On environmentalism, by the way, my argument is I want environmental policies that are effective, not environmental policies that make people feel good, and they're not the same thing. I don't understand the antagonism towards hybrid cars, right? By which I mean plug-in hybrids. Right. Mm-hmm. Most people, most days, they drive 50 miles, 60 miles. If you're in London, you're lucky if you can get 10 miles and you're only driving at 20 miles an hour anyway, right? If most of your motoring is done electrically through a plug-in hybrid, and then every now and then, oh my God, I've got an emergency, I have to go to Wales, and boom, the petrol engine kicks in. I get the fact that from a purist point of view, you've got to have two powertrains and two sources of weight in the vehicle. I get all that stuff. I buy all that. I get it. But it doesn't seem to be that bad. If you can reduce if with a plug-in hybrid, you can reduce your carbon emissions by 90%. Fuck it. In the interim, until that's, okay,
it's better. It's better than nothing, right?
It's better than nothing. So, likewise, you could, instead of having heat pumps, you could encourage people to get air conditioning, okay, and use it as a heat pump in Britain or Ireland, okay, 90% of the time. You're going to be using your air conditioning as a bloody heat source, as a heat pump. It's an air-to-air heat pump. That's what an air conditioning unit is. What you're just doing is you're running it backwards. And there are loads of air conditioning units available. They're reasonably affordable, and they're all being manufactured by years and years. And there are loads of people who know how to repair them, right? Oh, no, because then people might increase their energy consumption by using it as an air conditioning unit, which they wouldn't have done. This is Britain, for fuck's sake, right? It's going to be 2 weeks of the goddamn year. And Ireland, probably 6 days. Admittedly, you feel the heat when it...
3 days.
It's 3 days. It's true. Will be. Absolutely. Right?
I don't want to keep you any longer.
No.
I know what I'm saying
is that find out what people might actually willingly do and get them to do it, as you said. And if it's in the right direction, pat yourself on the back and be happy and make sure you don't lose momentum.
100%.
But I could get a grant for air conditioning units. I could install with my house. I would keep my boiler. I don't want to rip out my boiler, because what if it gets really, really fucking cold? I still want my boiler, okay? Because, for 3 days of the year, I might turn on my boiler because it's really bastard cold, right? And for 3 days of the year, it might be really bastard hot, and I turn on my air conditioning unit to cool rather than the heat. Fine, okay.
It's a step in the right direction, right? That's all that matters.
Yeah. There's a great concept, I think, for evolutionary biology, I'll end on this, which is called the adjacent possible. The adjacent possible is what can take you. It's a bit like that game show you get on TV in the middle of the day where people have to open up squares. Okay? There are people waiting for me. I better go. But basically, if you're moving in the right direction, or it's like blockbusters, right? If you're moving in the right direction, okay, that's good enough. We'll get you there eventually. Don't demand that people get... Anyway, I must go, but thank you ever so much. It's been a huge pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.